So the conciliar movement was, as we've said, a response to the problem of the Great Schism. There's a lot really that we could say. We could spend a lot of time on it. But I'm going to try and move pretty quickly through it, just in the interest of all the other things we want to get through. But the background to the conciliar movement actually goes to the Middle Ages, where they spent a lot of time thinking about different possibilities, and of course the theology was very elaborate, as we've seen in scholasticism. But legal thinking was also very well developed. And with the run of pretty awful popes, as we've seen, or at least several examples of bad popes, a number of canon lawyers and theologians began to think, what do we do if we're ever in a situation where the Pope is a heretic or does something so egregiously awful that it's just beyond the pale. And so they basically thought through this problem, and again, this is just legal theory. It was just sort of an idea that some people had held and had developed. But the idea was that if a pope falls into heresy, he could be removed. And the problem was, as we've seen, the medieval conception of the papacy was such that there was a sense that no one could judge the pope. So what do you do if no one can judge the Pope, and yet the Pope is in need of judgment because he's done something or continues to do something problematic or threatens the unity of the faith? And so some theorists said, well, in that case, a council can gather together, a general council can gather together to essentially try the Pope. Now, it should be said that this was definitely, a theory that in the Middle Ages and in the centuries we've just sort of been looking at, almost certainly would have had difficulty coming to fruition, just because of the way the popes themselves viewed their authority. They thought they could be tried by no one, and yet, there was a good deal of writing and thinking about this subject. And so, when we get into this situation with the Great Schism and Urban and Clement, as it starts to draw on, and now we're talking about 10, 15 years. Remember, this started in 1378, and we still have this problem as we hit the turn of the century, at 1400. And so, how did that sort of problem, or that question of the Pope falling into heresy, apply here? Well, pretty straightforwardly, the argument went that one of the sort of marks of the church is its unity. And so, to the extent that we had these two popes, and neither of them was willing to budge, they were both, through their obstinacy, threatening the unity of the church. And that threat to unity was in fact heretical. That their willingness to persist in schism, each of them, was sort of a de facto indication that they did not hold to the true faith. And in light of that situation, a council could convene itself to try and resolve it. So that's what we get as sort of the background theory to it. And now the question is, how does this work, or can this work in practice? Well, we get our first attempt in 1409 with the Council of Pisa. And what happened was, some cardinals, but not all, for each side, both the Avignon and the Rome lines, abandoned their respective popes and gathered together. Now, in response to this, just by way of background, even though there's not much to say, this council in Pisa is gathering, and a portion of each of the respective papal claimants, cardinals, are going. But in response, both the Rome and Avignon popes sort of call their own council, sort of to prove that no, this isn't a real council. My council is a real council. So we don't really know a lot about those in terms of they didn't really accomplish anything, and they're not viewed as legitimate. So the Council of Pisa had 22 cardinals and 80 bishops, which was pretty well attended given the time. And it was pretty straightforward in terms of its goal. It was to resolve the schism. And so basically the first order of business, the main order of business, was to try, if you will, put on trial the Roman and Avignonese popes for schism, for heresy. And so they do this, and they, of course, find them both guilty. I should say that, and we don't want to get too bogged down in details because I think it will be somewhat harder to follow in this format, but both Rome and Avignon are sort of continuing to develop their own papal lines. So as one dies, they select the next one. So we're past Urban and Clement. So Pisa comes in and deposes both of the popes and elects a new one who takes the name Alexander V. So he takes the name Alexander V in 1409. You see that on your outline. And unfortunately for him and for this movement in general, he dies pretty early on into his pontificate. Only a little less than a year, about 10 months, he was pope. And the follow-up to that, who also, the Council of Pisa had not adjourned. They kept meeting even after they elected the Pope because they thought, there's reform we need to get to. So the council then, the cardinals then get together and choose another guy who takes the name John the 23rd. Now, John the 23rd is sort of deeply problematic. He was kind of wild and probably somewhat immoral in some of his business dealings and other affairs, and just was not a compelling leader. And so within this sort of short period of about a year, you have the election of Alexander V, who then dies and is succeeded by John the 23rd from the Council of Pisa. But in the meantime, there needed to be some sense of willingness to put the other two claimants aside. Obviously the Roman and Avignonese popes weren't going to just sort of easily concede that they had been deposed by the council and that they should kind of go quietly into the night. But with political pressure and unity from the other bloc, it seemed likely that maybe this could work. But probably, looking back, what happens is, because Alexander V winds up dying in short order, and then we get another pope, John XXIII, who was not the best choice. There's some hesitance on the part of the political supporters of the other two popes to go along with this, because they see that this other guy might be kind of crazy too. So the net effect of this, and here's where it really starts to get fun, right? The net effect of this is neither the Roman claimant or the Avignonese claimant accepts the decisions of the Council of Pisa, and more importantly, their political supporters, the kings and princes who were backing each of them, they don't either. And so what this means is there's no sort of mechanism, whether political pressure or force, to remove the Roman and Avignonese popes. Meanwhile, we have got a pretty decent group of cardinals who had elected this new Pisan Pope and had met in council to depose the other two. So the net effect is we've created a third line of popes now. So there's the popes, what we're calling the Roman line, who follow after Urban VI, going back to 1378. Then you have the Avignonese line, there's only one successor to Clement VII, and he takes the name Benedict XIII. And then the Pisan line from the Council of Pisa, we have Alexander V, and he's replaced in less than a year by John XXIII. So now we have three lines of popes, and it is even more of a mess than when we started. Next, we should mention very briefly, in 1413, so a few years later, there was another attempt to call a council to deal with this problem, and this was called by John XXIII, the Pisan Pope. He said, well, let's try this again. And so we sometimes should talk about in the overall survey of this conciliar movement, the Council of Rome in 1413, a sort of dubious value. It again didn't have much support beyond the Pisan line, and not many people from the outside allegiances came, and so it didn't get very far, didn't do very much. But the point is just to show that this was still an ongoing concern that really finally will take hold, and now we'll start to see some progress with the conciliar movement, with conciliarism, the following year with the Council of Constance, which is going to meet beginning in 1414. Constance is in Switzerland. And the probably biggest driving force, as we've seen in so many other situations, was that by 1410, even earlier, the major European political powers are starting to get restless with this situation. There were some ways in which they benefited from the division. They could control parts of the church a little bit more easily. But there are other ways in which this division, through some of the operations and the bureaucracy, into chaos, and they also came to realize that, once again, this division within the church could lead to division internally in their kingdoms, and that this could be a problem. We've seen throughout the course how leaders tend to view religious unity as an imperative for political unity, or at least as something that goes along with it. So for the Council of Constance, we have the Holy Roman Emperor, a guy named Sigismund, Sigismund, really now starting to exert his authority to say, we need to take care of this. So he convinces once again the Pisan Pope to try again to call another council, and this is the Council of Constance. It begins in 1414, and it starts out by stating three goals that it's trying to resolve. There are some issues of heresy they need to address. They need to address the schism, and then also tackle this notion that we saw over 100 years prior at the Council of Mend, the reform of the church in head and members. In the end, once again, the participants were somewhat limited, but there was good participation from some cardinals from each line, but certainly the Pisan supporters, the ones who had broken away in 1409 to participate, they were all there, and they were actually pretty effective at moving a number of pieces of consideration, another sort of number of issues forward, and deliberating and deciding. It was slightly more effective than usual in its process. One of the earliest questions they had to address was, what's the source of our authority, if you will? And they do that by issuing a document called Haec Sancta in 1415. And I'll just read you a brief quote from Haec Sancta. This Holy Council of Constance declares, first, that it is lawfully assembled in the Holy Spirit, that it constitutes a general council representing the Catholic Church, and that therefore it has its authority immediately from Christ, and that all men of every rank and condition, including the Pope himself, are bound to obey it in matters concerning the faith, the abolition of the schism, and the reformation of the Church of God and its head and members. Secondly, it declares that anyone of any rank and condition who shall refuse to obey the orders, decrees, statutes, or instructions made or to be made by this Holy Council or by any other lawfully assembled General Council shall, unless he comes to a right frame of mind, be subjected to fitting penance and punished appropriately. So, in other words, the council itself is saying its authority comes directly from God because it's a general council representing the Catholic Church, and the Church is the Church of Christ, and as a result, everyone is bound to obey it, including the Pope. So, look, this is not an uncontroversial statement in light of the sort of papal monarchy that we've seen leading up to this. Nevertheless, this is what the council is saying about its own authority. And it was smart to do this in a way because it knew it was going to have to deal with the schism and the popes, and so it had to assert the authority to sit in judgment of them. John the 23rd, meanwhile, the Pisan Pope, who was kind of strong-armed into allowing this gathering to take place by the Holy Roman Emperor, he gets a little nervous, actually, once he sees this Haec Sancta, and once he sees that the council is going to move forward, and in a sense, he doesn't have a ton of control over it, and that the council believes it can judge everyone, including himself. So John the 23rd leaves, actually, in 1415. He departs from the council and says he's withdrawing his authority. And the council sort of waved goodbye and looked at him and said, well, that's fine, you can say that, but we just said in Haec Sancta that our authority comes from God, so we don't really need yours. So that they move forward with trying to resolve the schism by addressing each of the popes. John the 23rd is deposed in May of 1415. The Roman Pope at this time is a guy named Gregory the 12th. He is also threatened with deposition, and eventually, actually, Gregory the 12th, the Roman successor of Urban, sort of goes along with. He sees the writing on the wall and is willing to abdicate. So the Council of Constance basically said that Gregory the 12th, the Roman Pope, should be removed. But Gregory the 12th himself says, well, look, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to freely abdicate. What's sort of interesting here is the status of that decision is highly contested. Like, Gregory the 12th will stop being Pope. That's the end result's the same. But did he stop being Pope because the council told him to, or because he freely abdicated? It might seem like a minor point, but it's a question of sort of who has the higher authority. And then finally, Benedict XII, at this point the Avignon successor, is deposed a few years later in 1417. He does not accept this, but he wasn't terribly popular, and a number of his supporters sort of deserted him because they could see the writing on the wall, since the Council of Pisa, the Council of Constance, under the careful watch of the Holy Roman Emperor, was removing all of the popes. So basically, it wasn't done all in one fell swoop, but over the period of about 2 years. The Council of Constance orders all three of the men claiming to be Pope to be deposed. And it's basically successful in doing this. As I said, the Avignonese Pope resisted, but he doesn't really have any support, and so eventually it will succeed. So they basically finally meet their goal of removing the popes, and now with enough political support, the council is able to kind of sustain this decision. One of the other issues that they were trying to deal with was that of heresy, and the main challenge here was Jan Hus, a Czech reformer who had been influenced by a number of other kind of reform-minded people. Hus was very prominently denouncing corruption in the church, called for a number of changes, including greater access to the Bible for the common person, for the laity. He said the Bible ought to be translated into their own language. We saw in our last class why the church was very reluctant to do this. In fact, in a number of places prohibited this, but Huss is calling for that. And also importantly was a proponent of allowing the laity to receive communion under both kinds, which at the time was also prohibited. So he was excommunicated by John the 23rd, again the Pisan Pope, in 1410, and so he appealed to the next General Council. And so it was kind of like the council's responsibility to try this case and see whether or not he should have been excommunicated. He was told that he could have a fair trial, if you will. Come to the Council of Constance. We'll let you defend yourself and let the chips fall where they may. However, what actually happened was quite different. Huss arrives at the council, and almost immediately, within maybe a week or two, before they really even get to do anything with kind of hearing his arguments out, the council orders him arrested, and he's placed under sort of house arrest for several months. Eventually, he gets a limited chance to defend himself, but there's a lot of doubt that it was there was really meaningful openness to his arguments, and the council condemns him of heresy, convicts him, condemns him of heresy, and burns him at the stake. So this was, to a lot of his supporters, very shocking. They didn't think his lobbying for the Bible to be translated into the vernacular or to allow the laity to receive the chalice warranted burning at the stake, and they saw this as kind of heavy-handed assertion of authority by the council. Nonetheless, Huss is killed in 1415. So the next order of business eventually was to get to a new pope, to elect a new pope, I should say. And so you see, in a sense, that they deposed the Roman line and the Pisan line pretty quickly. And eventually the Avignonese line sort of has to concede that he has no support. But the Council of Constance didn't immediately move to elect a successor. They waited about 2 years. And so they finally get together in a conclave within the council and elect Martin V in 1417. And he was elected by a group of cardinals that had previously been obedient, if you will, to all three of the different popes. So we do have the election of a new pope, Martin V, and Martin V will kind of successfully mark the end of the Great Schism. All three of the lines, the Roman, the Avignonese, and the Pisan line, are all kind of done away with, and now we have Martin V as a result of the Council of Constance. If you remember, we had resolving the schism, dealing with heresy, and reform of the church as the three goals. Well, we saw how they dealt with the first two. So the way to deal with the third, kind of the issue of reform, was to make councils a regular feature of the church, because they can deal with issues as they arise, and they can be a check on kind of runaway papal authority. And so the Council of Constance issues a document, Frequens, in 1417. And as the name implies, the idea is that council should be a frequent or regular feature of the church. Basically, it says that there should be set intervals at which councils should automatically be held. Specifically, it said there should be a council in 5 years after this one closed, then one in 7 years, and then one every 10 years or so. And so they wanted it to be a regular feature of the church. So that's the Council of Constance, an incredibly important and eventful council. It resolves the schism, it ends it, results in the election of a new pope. And yet there's kind of an underlying tension here, which maybe you're already starting to think about, which is, how do the sort of previous claims of papal authority interact with or run into the claims of conciliar authority that we've seen once there's not, 2 or 3 guys claiming to be pope, once there's one pope. And, we have that situation now, and we'll see as soon as essentially the Council of Constance is over and Martin V, starts to function as pope, there's going to be the development of tension within this dynamic of council versus pope. So the next council in this period of conciliarism was the Council of what we call now Pavia Siena. It started in Pavia in Italy and was transferred to Siena. And you'll notice the year 1423 is no coincidence. Shortly after Frequens was issued at the Council of Constance, the Council of Constance closed, but it was 1418. And so, according to Frequens, the next council should meet in 5 years, and that made it 1423. So they're following the precedent issued in Frequens. The Council of Pavia Siena, it started in Pavia, as I said. The plague winds up kind of breaking out in Pavia, and so they moved to Siena. Martin V, the Pope, sent just a delegate. He didn't want to be there in person, and his delegates were sort of a thorn in the side of all the deliberations. Already 5 years into this kind of aftermath of Constance, there's a number of examples, of tension between the Pope and the council or the various cardinals. And so he's now starting to be fearful that the councils will set themselves up as an authority above himself. So the papal delegates to the council kind of gum up the works and prevent anything from really happening. The point here is just to notice that already there's papal opposition to conciliarism. The next council will meet once again back in Switzerland, in Basel, in 1431. And you see there, 7 years after the close of Pavia Siena, so we're still kind of following Frequens. Martin V, the Pope, had died right around the time when he called for the council, but was unable to attend once it was about to convene. And he's replaced by a guy named Eugenius IV. Eugenius IV, like Martin, was pretty suspicious to the growing claims of authority that the councils had adopted in previous sessions. And so he basically acts as a force of opposition to the council. This really takes the form of the Pope says, I want to transfer the council. I want to move the council to another place to convene. And the reason he did this is because there was a sense that maybe there could be negotiations with the Eastern Church at reunion. And the Eastern Church, for a number of reasons that we can't get into, was under threat. And there was a sense that maybe, we ought to reconsider the notion of Christian unity, and there could be some benefits to everyone if this were to happen. And so the Pope says, kind of uses this as the incentive for transferring the council, because he can work out a deal with the Eastern Church. And but the council itself, sort of the leaders of the council, say, no, we're here in Basel, weather's very pleasant, and we don't want to go anywhere. And so almost from the beginning, there's opposition between the Pope and the council. What happens next is kind of just to prove to Eugenius IV who's in charge, the Council of Basel gathers and reissues Haec Sancta in 1432. And eventually they'll do this yet an additional time. It's basically, just asserting their authority by pointing to a previous document. There's no real actual significance or meaning to it. And again, I don't get political for the sake of trying to be on one side or the other, but it kind of was reminding me of the fact that they issued it a second time and then eventually a third time. It reminded me of in the previous administration when the Republicans in the House of Representatives kept passing these repeals of the healthcare law. Everyone knew nothing was going to happen, but they were just like saying, "See, look what we did. We've passed this repeal. It should be repealed." Of course, it wasn't going to go anywhere. There was no really news there that it was going to be vetoed or wasn't going to pass the Senate. Yet it was just a show of where they stood, and this is kind of what's happening with the reissuing of Haec Sancta a second and a third time. These are just symbolic acts to say that, hey, remember, the council is superior to the Pope or above the Pope in authority. This doesn't really work, as you can imagine. Once the Pope had decided that he didn't really want to play ball with them, it's just a gesture that's kind of empty. Eugenius is still working on this idea of moving the council, and eventually is successful, if you will, in transferring the council to Ferrara, and then it will eventually move to Florence and Rome, because he wants to move closer to the east to negotiate with the Greeks in hopes of reunion. And so there's a transfer of the council in 1437 that finally Eugenius is able to convince a number of people, but not everyone, to move. And that will lead to the Council of Ferrara, or what you see on your outline is the Council of Ferrara, Florence, Rome, because it moved a number of times. What's important to notice here, though, is some members of the Council of Basel refused. They still refused. So some went along with the Pope and said, okay, we'll move to Ferrara, but others said, no, we won't. And those who stayed behind issued a document, a proclamation, annulling the transfer and declaring itself still in session at Basel. And so what we have here now is the members who stayed behind at the Council of Basel have created a de facto schism themselves. They've created a schismatic council. And that's why you see, if you're looking at your outline, you have overlapping dates. You have the Council of Basel technically running, or in a way it seems like it was running through 1449. Meanwhile, you have the Council of Ferrara, Florence meeting concurrently. And that's because there's sort of now two competing councils. So as if all of this wasn't confusing enough, we have now two different councils. Of course, as part of this resistance to Eugenius, they don't recognize his authority. They see him as in sort of violation of Haec Sancta and resisting the council, and that makes him a heretic. So they depose him and elect Felix V in 1439. And once again we have a competing line of popes, although this isn't going to get very far because, at least temporarily, Eugenius IV was able to successfully negotiate a reunion with the Greeks in 1439. Laetentur Caeli means let the heavens rejoice. And I'm not going to say too much about it because, as you all know, like this union didn't last. It was kind of a political move to try and marshal support under threat. Theologically, the document basically punted on all the issues dividing East and West, filioque, papal authority. All of those things were treated kind of ambiguously, like, you believe what you believe, we believe what we believe, and we'll all just sort of pretend that it's okay. Again, the East was hoping that maybe they could gain some military protection through this reunion. Of course, the various Islamic armies were threatening Constantinople, which will eventually fall in 1453. The Council of Ferrara, Florence, Rome also condemns the ongoing schismatic Council of Basel. So the reunion with the Greeks was obviously short-lived. I mean, it probably didn't last more than a few years, even in theory, and in practice it never really existed. But it was political kind of affirmation that Eugenius IV was really leading the church, and that made the Council of Basel even more of a breakaway. And so what we see is a real blow to those who had stayed behind at Basel, and eventually Felix V, the breakaway pope, is forced to resign, and the Council of Basel is dissolved in 1449. So in evaluating this conciliar movement, we can sort of note a number of things. It definitely passed some reforms, but not maybe as many as it would have liked. A very important outcome was that it did restore church unity. It ended the Great Schism. That was a real accomplishment. However, as we've seen, there were a number of problems inherent in this dynamic. So we might ask ourselves, why did conciliarism fail? Certainly, once the schism was resolved, having one pope, that pope was always going to be opposed to the idea that he was below the council. And so the popes would undermine it through various means. Probably just as important, Basil made a pretty fatal mistake by reintroducing schism. That seemed like an unnecessary provocation, and it really kind of hurt the likelihood of conciliarism remaining a regular feature of the church. And then finally, and I think this also makes sense to us, at this time, as we've been seeing, national identities forming, but importantly in political terms, monarchies are more and more coming into strength across Europe. And so the monarchy was seen as kind of the right form, the best form of government. And the church should also, in a sense, be a monarchy. It shouldn't be a parliament. So that's the conciliar movement, an important kind of episode in the church, especially in response to the Great Schism. But as we see, plagued by a number of challenges that will ultimately prevent it from being successful.